He became an orphan during the Revolution, scarred by war, a man who killed a rival in a duel and later rose to become a general, and a populist hero who became the 7th President of the United States. He was also a wealthy slave owner and the architect of a brutal policy of ethnic cleansing. Andrew Jackson's life is a raw, violent, and deeply human chronicle of power, ambition, and the staggering contradictions at the heart of the American story. Born into poverty on the Carolina frontier in 1767, Jackson's early life was shaped by the American Revolution, a conflict that left him an orphan at 14 with a lifelong hatred for the British. Out of that loss, he became a man of iron will, a self-made frontier lawyer who clawed his way to wealth and power in the wilds of Tennessee. His improbable victory at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815 catapulted him to national fame as Old Hickory, the indomitable champion of the common man. As president, Jackson waged war on the nation's financial elite, expanded democracy for white men, and became the first and only president to briefly pay off the national debt. Yet, this champion of the people was also responsible for the Indian Removal Act, a policy that led to the forced migration and death of thousands of Native Americans on the Trail of Tears. His story is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It's the story of a man who embodied both the best and worst of his nation, a figure whose complex and controversial legacy continues to shape America today. Andrew Jackson was born in the Waxhaw settlement on the Carolina frontier. Born on March 15, 1767, into a remote community of hardy Scots-Irish immigrants, his world was one of constant struggle. They were not gentle people. They were fiercely independent, suspicious of authority, and prepared to defend their honor with violence. This nature of conflict and hardship was ingrained in Jackson from his first breath. His life began in tragedy. His father died in an accident just weeks before he was born, leaving his mother Elizabeth a destitute widow in a new land. Raised in a log cabin amidst a vast, intimidating wilderness, Jackson's education came not from books, but from the brutal realities of frontier life. He learned that survival belonged to the strong and the ruthless. He was a wild, competitive boy, possessed by a temper not of heat, but of white-hot lightning, a fury that struck without warning and left scars. Lacking a father, an inheritance, or any social advantage, Jackson was armed with only a burning ambition and an unyielding will. He learned early that life was fragile and power was everything. The harsh world of the frontier had forged a boy of pure grit, and that inner fire was about to be stoked into a raging inferno by the winds of war. The American Revolution for the people of the Waxhaws was not a distant debate about taxes and representation. It was a brutal fratricidal civil war that erupted at their very doorsteps. The conflict in the Carolina backcountry was a war of neighbors, a savage contest of raids, ambushes, and reprisal killings between patriot and loyalist militias. There were no clean lines of battle, no gentlemanly codes of conduct. It was a war of extermination, where captured men were often butchered and homesteads were burned to the ground. This was the war that consumed the Jackson family. In 1779, his eldest brother Hugh, who had joined a patriot regiment, died after the Battle of Stono Ferry, most likely from heat exhaustion during the retreat rather than direct combat. He was only 16. The following year, the war crashed into the Waxhaws with catastrophic force. In May 1780, a force of about 350 Virginia patriots under Colonel Abraham Buford was caught by the ruthless British cavalry commander, Banastre Tarleton, just a few miles from the Jackson home. What followed became known as the Waxhaw Massacre. Buford's men were outmaneuvered and tried to surrender, but Tarleton's dragoons gave no quarter, cutting down the surrendering and wounded men where they stood. Estimates suggest over 100 patriots were killed and many others wounded or maimed. Young Andrew and his brother Robert helped tend to the mangled survivors, who were brought to the local Presbyterian church, which had been turned into a makeshift hospital. The 13-year-old boy was submerged in the unvarnished horror of war. It was a symphony of hell. The screams of men in agony, the sight of wounds that defied anatomy, the thick metallic stench of blood. The experience hardened him, erasing any boyish illusions about the glory of combat. Driven by a thirst for revenge, Andrew and Robert briefly joined a local militia unit as irregular fighters. They were not formal soldiers. They were partisans, guerrilla fighters. At 13, Andrew was too young for the front lines, so he served as a scout and a courier, his knowledge of the local terrain making him invaluable. He participated in several skirmishes, including the Battle of Hanging Rock, where he witnessed the chaos and savagery of frontier fighting up close. In April 1781, their luck ran out. A British raiding party surrounded the house where they were staying. The Jackson boys were captured. Their imprisonment was a nightmare of starvation, disease, and abuse. It was during this captivity that the incident that would define Jackson's life occurred. A British officer, his boots caked with mud, pointed at them and arrogantly ordered Andrew to clean them. The boy, filled with a defiant pride that bordered on suicidal, refused. "Sir, I am a prisoner of war," he declared, and claimed to be treated as such. The officer's face flushed with fury at this insolence from a scruffy backwoods rebel. He drew his sword and lunged. Andrew, reacting in a split second, threw up his left hand to shield his face. The blade sliced through his fingers and into his head, gashing him to the bone. He fell to the floor, bleeding profusely. The officer then turned on his brother Robert for also refusing, striking him a similar blow. The scars from that sword slash, one on his head, another on his hand, would remain with Jackson for the rest of his life. They were a permanent physical reminder of British tyranny and arrogance. But the psychological scar was even deeper. It solidified a hatred for the British that would burn within him for decades. And it reinforced his core belief: never, ever bow to an enemy. Defy them, fight them, and if necessary, die on your feet rather than live on your knees. The brothers, along with other prisoners, were marched 40 miles to a military prison in Camden, South Carolina. The conditions were horrific. They were thrown into a crowded, squalid stockade with no medicine, little food, and rampant disease. Both Andrew and Robert contracted smallpox. They wasted away, ravaged by fever and hunger. They surely would have died there had it not been for the indomitable will of their mother, Elizabeth. When she heard where her sons were being held, she journeyed to Camden and somehow negotiated a prisoner exchange, trading a handful of British soldiers for her 2 boys and 5 of their neighbors. The journey home was another ordeal. There were only 2 horses for 7 prisoners. Robert was so sick he had to be held on his horse, while Andrew, still reeling from smallpox and his untreated wounds, walked barefoot and feverish for 40 miles through the rain. 2 days after they reached the safety of their home, Robert died. Elizabeth had lost another son to the war. Now only Andrew remained. But Elizabeth's work was not done. In a final, heroic act of self-sacrifice, she heard of the appalling conditions aboard the British prison ships anchored in Charleston Harbor, where hundreds of American prisoners, including some of her own nephews, were dying of cholera. She and 2 other women volunteered to go and nurse them. She spent weeks in the pestilent, floating hellholes, tending to the sick and dying, but her luck and her strength had finally run out. She contracted the disease herself. In November 1781, Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson died and was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave somewhere near Charleston. A small package containing her clothes and a heartfelt letter of condolence was all that was sent back to her last surviving child. At the age of 14, Andrew Jackson was completely and utterly alone. His entire immediate family, father, mother, and 2 brothers, was gone. He was an orphan of the Revolution, a boy who had seen more death and brutality than most men see in a lifetime. The war had forged America, but it had shattered his world. The profound grief, the searing rage, the bitter sense of abandonment, these emotions became the bedrock of his character. He was left with nothing but a legacy of hatred for his enemies, and a ferocious, all-consuming drive to impose his will upon a world that had, up to that point, done nothing but take from him. The years immediately following the war were a blur of confusion and aimlessness for the young orphan. He briefly tried his hand at saddle-making, but found the work tedious. He inherited a small sum of money from his Irish grandfather, and for a short time moved to Charleston, where he tried to live the life of a young gentleman. He gambled, drank, and caroused, quickly squandering his inheritance. It was a period of wild rebellion, a desperate attempt to outrun the ghosts of his past. But he soon realized that this path led only to ruin. He needed a profession, a way to build a life of substance and power, a way to ensure he would never be vulnerable again. He made a decision that would change the course of his life. He would become a lawyer. He moved to Salisbury, North Carolina, and began to read law in the office of a prominent attorney, a common practice at the time. It was a rigorous apprenticeship, but he threw himself into it. He was not a brilliant legal scholar, but he possessed a quick mind, a powerful memory, and a formidable presence. He understood that on the frontier, the law was less about elegant philosophical arguments and more about raw intimidation and force of will, qualities he had in abundance. In 1787, he was admitted to the North Carolina bar. He was 20 years old. The established towns of North Carolina felt constrained and stuffy to him. He craved open space, risk, and opportunity. His gaze, like that of so many ambitious young men of his generation, turned westward, toward the new settlements rising beyond the Appalachian Mountains, mountains in what would soon become the state of Tennessee. In 1788, he was appointed public prosecutor for the Western District of North Carolina, a vast lawless territory centered around the frontier outpost of Nashville. He packed his belongings, bought a fine horse, and with his dueling pistols at the ready, set off on the perilous journey over the mountains. Nashville, in 1788, was not much more than a collection of log forts and cabins clinging to the banks of the Cumberland River, an island of settlement in a sea of wilderness. It was a violent, chaotic place. Land claims were constantly disputed, debts went unpaid, and conflicts with the local Cherokee and Creek nations were frequent and bloody. The job of prosecutor was a dangerous one. The debtors and criminals he was tasked with bringing to justice were a rough, armed, and unruly bunch. Many previous prosecutors had been intimidated or run out of town. Jackson was different. He arrived with a reputation for toughness that preceded him, and he immediately set to work with a relentless energy. In his first month, he issued over 70 writs to delinquent debtors. When challenged, he didn't back down. He was quick to a duel and fearless in a courtroom brawl. He established order not through legal eloquence, but through sheer, unyielding force of personality. He made it clear that he was a man who could not be cowed. It was in Nashville that he first began to acquire wealth and status. He was shrewd in his dealings, often accepting land as payment for his legal services. He speculated aggressively, buying up vast tracts of territory that he correctly guessed would soon be valuable. And, like other successful men in the region, his growing prosperity was built upon the institution of slavery. He bought his first enslaved person in 1788 and would continue to buy and sell human beings for the rest of his life, eventually becoming one of the largest slaveholders in Tennessee. For Jackson, this was not a moral contradiction. It was simply the way of the world, the natural order of a society where his democratic ideals applied only to white men. During his early days in Nashville, he lived as a boarder at the home of a widow named Rachel Donaldson. It was there that he met her daughter, Rachel Donaldson Robards. She was a striking woman, vivacious, charming, with beautiful dark eyes. But she was trapped in a miserable marriage to a man named Captain Lewis Robards, a pathologically jealous and abusive man. Jackson, the orphan who had never known a stable family life, was immediately drawn to her warmth and kindness, and Rachel, suffocated by her husband's cruelty, was drawn to Jackson's strength and protective nature. A dangerous, magnetic love ignited between them. The situation was explosive. Robards, consumed by jealousy, repeatedly accused Rachel of infidelity with Jackson and threatened her life. Jackson confronted him, and the two men nearly came to blows. In 1790, Robards petitioned the Virginia legislature for a divorce, a rare and difficult process at the time. Believing that a divorce had been granted, Andrew and Rachel, now deeply in love and convinced she was a free woman, eloped to Natchez, then in Spanish territory, and were married in the summer of 1791. They returned to Tennessee and began their life together, building a home and a future. 2 years later, a bombshell dropped that would change their lives forever and haunt Jackson for the rest of his days. They discovered that Lewis Robards had never completed the divorce. The Virginia legislature had only granted him permission to sue for divorce. The final decree was not granted until 1793, on the grounds of Rachel's adultery with Jackson. This meant that for 2 years, their marriage had been legally void, and Rachel was, technically, a bigamist and an adulteress. When they learned the devastating news, they immediately and quietly remarried in a proper ceremony in 1794. But the damage was done. In the honor-obsessed culture of the frontier, there could be no greater stain on a woman's reputation. And for Jackson, there could be no greater insult. He was pathologically protective of Rachel. The slurs and whispers about her character became a source of incandescent rage for him. He saw any mention of the scandal as a direct attack on his own honor and his wife's virtue. It became the third rail of his life. To touch it was to invite a violent and potentially lethal response. This deep personal wound would fester for years, and the poison it generated would eventually lead him to a dueling ground at dawn, with a pistol in his hand and murder in his heart. As Tennessee grew, so did Jackson's political career. When the territory became a state in 1796, he was elected its first representative to Congress. He later served a brief and unremarkable term as a U.S. Senator before returning to Tennessee to become a judge on the state Superior Court, a position he held for 6 years. He was known as a judge who was fair, but impatient with legal technicalities, always eager to get to the heart of a matter and dispense what he considered common sense justice. He also became the Major General of the Tennessee Militia, a position that suited his temperament perfectly, but his primary focus was on building his personal empire. He bought the property that would become the Hermitage, initially a simple log farmhouse that he would later transform into a grand plantation mansion. He and Rachel, unable to have children of their own, adopted one of her nephews, naming him Andrew Jackson Jr. Their home was known for its hospitality, but Jackson's life was punctuated by frequent spasms of violence. His business dealings, land speculation, and hair-trigger sense of honor led him into a series of brawls and duels. The most notorious of these, the one that would forever mark him as a killer, was yet to come. The storm that had been gathering since his marriage finally broke in 1806. The feud with Charles Dickinson, a young, arrogant lawyer and famously skilled marksman, began over a forfeited horse race bet, but quickly spiraled into something much uglier. Dickinson, encouraged by Jackson's political enemies, began to publicly mock Jackson, and then made the fatal mistake of bringing up the old scandal surrounding his marriage, reportedly calling Jackson a worthless scoundrel, a poltroon, and a coward, and slandering Rachel in a local tavern. For Jackson, this was the ultimate transgression. He challenged Dickinson to a duel. The terms were savage. They would stand at 8 paces, incredibly close range, and fire. Because of Dickinson's reputation as a crack shot, Jackson devised a chilling strategy. He would allow Dickinson to shoot first. He would wear a loose-fitting coat to obscure the shape of his body, calculating that even if he were hit, Dickinson's shot would likely not be fatal. He would endure the wound, and then, with unwavering calm, take his time to aim and kill his opponent. On the morning of May 30th, 1806, they met in a poplar grove in Kentucky, just across the state line, as dueling was illegal in Tennessee. At the signal, Dickinson fired instantly. The .50 caliber ball slammed into Jackson's chest just to the left of his breastbone. It shattered 2 ribs and buried itself inches from his heart. The force of the impact lifted him off his feet, and his surgeon, who was acting as his second, saw dust fly from his coat. Jackson pressed his hand to the wound to stanch the flow of blood, stood erect, and stared at his opponent with cold fury. Dickinson, shocked that Jackson was still standing, cried out, "My God, have I missed him?" According to the rigid rules of the Code Duello, Dickinson had to remain perfectly still as Jackson prepared his return shot. Slowly, deliberately, Jackson raised his pistol. He squeezed the trigger, but the hammer stopped at half-cock. It was a misfire. By some interpretations of the code, this should have ended the duel, but Jackson would have none of it. He recocked the pistol, took careful aim at the horrified Dickinson, and fired again. The bullet struck Dickinson low in the abdomen, severing an artery. He collapsed, bleeding profusely, and died later that evening in agony. Jackson walked from the field, his left boot filled with blood from the wound. He had defended his wife's honor. He had vanquished his enemy, but the cold-bloodedness of the act, surviving a shot to the chest, then calmly recocking his pistol to execute his foe, horrified many. For a time, he was a social outcast, seen not as an honorable duelist, but as a brutal killer. The bullet Dickinson fired would remain lodged in his chest for the rest of his life, a source of chronic pain and a constant internal reminder of the lengths he would go to protect his name and the woman he loved. The orphan from the Waxhaws had become one of the most formidable and feared men in Tennessee, a man whose life was written in land deeds, legal statutes, and the blood of his enemies. And soon, the nation would call on him to spill the blood of a foreign power. The dawn of the 19th century found Andrew Jackson at a crossroads. He was a man of immense local importance, a former judge, a militia general, a wealthy planter, but the duel with Charles Dickinson had left a dark stain on his name. He was feared, but not universally respected. He receded from public life for a time, focusing on his plantation and his horses, but the man and the moment were destined to collide. In 1812, the United States once again declared war on Great Britain. The conflict was sparked by British interference with American shipping and the impressment of American sailors, but for Jackson and his fellow Westerners, it was something more. It was a second war of independence, a chance to finally expel British influence from the continent and to settle scores with their Native American allies who stood in the way of westward expansion. Jackson, as Major General of the Tennessee Militia, was consumed by a patriotic fire. This was the enemy of his childhood, the nation that had orphaned him and scarred him. He eagerly raised a force of 2,000 volunteers and marched them down to Natchez, expecting to be ordered to attack Spanish Florida, a haven for British agents and hostile Creek factions. But the campaign was a fiasco of mismanagement by the War Department in Washington. After months of languishing in the swamps with no orders, the command came not to fight but to disband his army, 500 miles from home, with no provisions and no pay. It was an order that would have broken a lesser man, but for Jackson it was an opportunity to forge a legend. He refused. He would not abandon his men, many of whom were sick and without transport. "They shall at all events be returned to their homes," he declared, his voice like flint. He used his own credit to purchase supplies and spent every waking hour tending to the sick and marching on foot alongside them to give his horses to the ailing. It was on this brutal march home that his soldiers, witnessing his incredible toughness and his paternal devotion to their welfare, gave him a nickname that would last forever. They said he was as tough as a hickory branch, the hardest wood they knew. They called him Old Hickory. He had brought his army home intact, defying the government to do so, and in the process had transformed a military failure into a triumph of leadership. His reputation was restored, and just in time. A storm of unimaginable violence was about to break over the southern frontier. For years, the brilliant Shawnee leader Tecumseh had been traveling among the southern tribes, preaching a message of pan-Indian unity and resistance to white encroachment. His words found fertile ground among a militant faction of the Creek Nation known as the Red Sticks. In August 1813, the Red Sticks, supplied with British weapons from Florida, unleashed their fury on a fortified American settlement called Fort Mims in what is now Alabama. They overran the fort and carried out a horrific massacre, slaughtering over 250 white settlers and allied Creeks, men, women, and children, in a frenzy of ritualistic violence. News of the massacre sent a shockwave of terror and outrage across the frontier. The response was immediate and vengeful. Tennessee called on its toughest general, Andrew Jackson, to lead the counterattack, though he was still recovering from the brutal tavern brawl with the Benton brothers, his left arm in a sling, a bullet still lodged in his shoulder, and in so much pain he could barely stand. Jackson rose from his sickbed. "The health of your general is restored," he announced, his eyes blazing. "He will command in person." What followed was one of the most brutal campaigns in the annals of American warfare. Jackson was a relentless commander. He drove his army south into the heart of Creek territory through a forbidding wilderness, facing not only the Red Stick warriors, but also his old enemies, mutiny and starvation. His supply lines were a disaster, and his men, mostly short-term volunteers, were often on the verge of open rebellion. Jackson showed no mercy. He would ride out to personally block the path of deserting soldiers, his one good arm brandishing a pistol, threatening to shoot the first man who took another step. On one occasion, he had a young militiaman named John Woods executed by firing squad for insubordination, an act of shocking severity designed to impose iron discipline on his unruly army. His strategy against the Red Sticks was one of total annihilation. He attacked them in a series of bloody battles, burning their villages, destroying their crops, and killing warriors and non-combatants alike. He was waging a war not just of conquest, but of terror. The climax came on March 27, 1814, at a place called Tohopica, or Horseshoe Bend. Here, on a peninsula formed by a sharp curve in the Tallapoosa River, over 1,000 Red Stick warriors, along with hundreds of women and children, had gathered in a heavily fortified village. They believed their position was impregnable. Jackson surrounded them. He unleashed a blistering artillery bombardment, then sent his men, including a regiment of Cherokee allies, storming over the formidable log barricade. The battle devolved into a slaughterhouse. For hours, the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and burning pine from the huts, punctuated by the shrieks of the warriors and the chilling silence that followed. The Red Sticks, refusing to surrender, were hunted down in the smoke-filled darkness of their own homes. By the time the sun set, the river was running red with blood. More than 800 Creek warriors lay dead. Jackson's own forces suffered fewer than 50 fatalities. It was not a battle. It was an extermination. In the aftermath, his soldiers skinned the bodies of the dead Creeks to make souvenir bridle reins. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend shattered the power of the Creek Nation forever. Jackson summoned the surviving chiefs to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson. He was not in a negotiating mood. He dictated the terms, forcing the Creeks, including allies who had fought alongside him, to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, 1814, ceding 23 million acres of their land, a vast territory that encompassed more than half of present-day Alabama and southern Georgia. He had broken the Red Sticks, opened a massive swath of land for white settlement, and established himself as the most formidable Indian fighter in America. In the aftermath, Jackson walked through a field of corpses his own orders had created. It was there he found an orphaned Creek boy clinging to his dead mother. In a paradox that would define his life, the architect of this slaughter took the boy, named him Lincoya, and sent him home to be raised as a son, an act of private mercy performed in the shadow of public extermination. His victory earned him a commission as a major general in the U.S. Army and command of the entire southern military district. His next opponent would not be a band of Creek warriors, but the most powerful army on earth. While Jackson was pacifying the Creeks, the wider war had been going disastrously for the Americans. In August 1814, British forces had captured Washington, D.C., and burned the White House and the Capitol to the ground. Now, with Napoleon defeated in Europe, Britain was free to turn its full attention to the American war. They devised a knockout blow, a massive invasion of the Gulf Coast, with the ultimate prize being the city of New Orleans. Control of New Orleans meant control of the Mississippi River, the great commercial artery of the American West. Its capture would sever the United States in two and potentially force a humiliating peace. The British assembled a formidable armada, carrying over 10,000 veteran troops, men who had fought and won against Napoleon's finest armies in the Peninsular War. Their commanders were some of the most respected in the British military. Against this juggernaut, the defenses of New Orleans were pitiful. The city was in a state of panic. Its citizens were a fractious mix of French Creoles, Spanish, Americans, Germans, Irish, and a large population of free people of color and enslaved Africans. There were few regular troops, and the local militia was poorly organized and of questionable loyalty. The situation seemed hopeless. Into this cauldron of fear and chaos rode Andrew Jackson in December 1814. He arrived gaunt and weary, still suffering from his wounds and chronic dysentery, but his eyes burned with an unholy fire. He immediately took absolute control. He declared martial law, suspending the writ of habeas corpus and imposing a strict curfew. He threatened to hang anyone who spoke of surrender. His iron will and ferocious energy electrified the city. I will smash them, so help me God, he vowed. He began to assemble one of the most bizarre and diverse armies ever seen. To the core of his tough Tennessee and Kentucky frontiersmen, clad in buckskin and carrying their long rifles, he added the local Creole militia, 2 battalions of free black soldiers, a contingent of Choctaw warriors, and, in a masterstroke of pragmatism, he accepted the help of the notorious pirate Jean Lafitte and his Barratarian smugglers. Lafitte and his men were expert cannoneers, and Jackson, despite the governor's objections, pardoned them in exchange for their loyalty and their precious supplies of ammunition and artillery. He chose his ground brilliantly, on the east bank of the Mississippi at the Rodriguez Canal, a dry moat that stretched from the river to an impassable cypress swamp. Here, his army of misfits worked day and night in the mud and rain, building a massive defensive earthwork that became known as Line Jackson. It was a formidable rampart, fronted by a deep canal, a killing ground of his own design. The British, under the command of General Sir Edward Pakenham, brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington, were overconfident. They disdained the American rabble they faced and expected a quick victory. After a series of preliminary skirmishes and a massive but ineffective artillery duel on New Year's Day, Pakenham decided on a full frontal assault. The morning of January 8, 1815, dawned cold and thick with fog. As the mist began to clear, the Americans on Line Jackson beheld a terrifying and magnificent sight. A seemingly endless line of British soldiers, their red coats and bayonets gleaming, stretched across the plain, advancing with perfect discipline to the sound of fifes and drums. It was the epitome of European military might, a force that had broken the best armies in the world. Jackson walked down the line of his men, a motley collection of pirates, aristocrats, and frontiersmen. "Stand to your guns, boys," he said calmly. "Don't waste your ammunition. See that every shot tells." Behind the earthen wall, the Americans waited, their rifles resting on the rampart. They were not a professional army, but they were perhaps the finest marksmen in the world. As the British came within range, the American artillery opened up, tearing huge holes in the advancing red lines. Then the riflemen went to work. They fired in coordinated volleys, a relentless rolling wave of lead that shattered the British formations. The frontiersmen, with their long rifles, picked off officers with chilling precision. The British lines faltered, but their discipline was incredible. They closed ranks and kept coming, marching directly into a hurricane of fire. The result was a slaughter unlike anything the British veterans had ever seen. General Pakenham, riding forward to rally his men, was hit by grapeshot and killed. His second-in-command, General Gibbs, was mortally wounded. His third-in-command, General Keane, was severely injured. Within 25 minutes, the main British assault was a bloody, chaotic wreck. The field in front of Line Jackson was a carpet of red-coated dead and wounded. The attack had been utterly, catastrophically repulsed. When the final tally was taken, the figures were so lopsided as to be almost unbelievable. The British suffered around 2,000 casualties, including nearly 300 killed, while American losses were reported as fewer than 100 killed and a few hundred wounded or missing. Unbeknownst to both sides, the Treaty of Ghent, officially ending the war, had been signed in Europe 2 weeks earlier. The battle was, in a strict military sense, unnecessary. But that didn't matter. News of the victory at New Orleans swept across the United States like a wildfire. In a war marked by humiliating defeats and political division, here was a moment of pure, unqualified triumph. It was David versus Goliath, the New World frontiersman versus the Old World aristocrat, and David had won. The victory unleashed a wave of national pride and unity that healed the wounds of a divisive war, and Andrew Jackson was its avatar. He was no longer just a Tennessee general, he was the savior of New Orleans, the hero of the Republic, the most famous and beloved man in America. His path to the White House had begun on that bloody field, but the hero's halo was not without its shadows. Even after the victory, Jackson maintained his iron grip on New Orleans, refusing to lift martial law and jailing a federal judge who dared to question his authority. He was a man who saw the world in black and white as a struggle between his will and those who would defy it. This trait would serve him well on the battlefield, but it would prove far more complicated in the world of politics. In 1818, the nation would call on him again to pacify the southern border, and once more Jackson would follow his own rules. During the First Seminole War, he again exceeded his orders, invading Spanish Florida, deposing the Spanish governor, and, in an act that created an international firestorm, he captured and executed 2 British citizens, Alexander Arbuthnot and Robert Ambrister, for aiding the Seminoles. He was nearly censured by Congress, but his immense popularity saw him through the crisis. His actions, though illegal, ultimately forced Spain to sell Florida to the U.S. For Jackson, the ends always justified the means. As the era of good feelings, a period of one-party rule by the Democratic Republicans, drew to a close, the nation's politics began to fracture. The presidential election of 1824 became a 4-way contest between Jackson, the military hero, John Quincy Adams, the brilliant but aloof Secretary of State, William Crawford, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Clay, the powerful Speaker of the House. Jackson was the clear popular favorite. He won the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, but he failed to win an outright majority. According to the Constitution, the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. What happened next would poison American politics for years. Henry Clay, who had come in fourth and was thus out of the running, detested Jackson, viewing him as a dangerous military chieftain unfit for the presidency. Clay used his immense influence as Speaker of the House to swing the vote to John Quincy Adams. When Adams won, he promptly nominated Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State, the traditional stepping stone to the presidency. To Jackson and his supporters, this was a blatant and unforgivable act of political corruption. They howled in outrage, decrying it as a corrupt bargain. They believed the will of the people had been stolen by a cabal of Washington insiders in a dirty backroom deal. Jackson, who had returned to his farm believing he had won, was consumed by a righteous fury. The Judas of the West has closed the contract and will receive the 30 pieces of silver, he seethed, referring to Clay. Was there ever witnessed such a barefaced corruption in any country before? The corrupt bargain did more than just deny Jackson the presidency in 1824. It gave him a cause and a new political identity. He was no longer just a military hero. He was the people's champion, the virtuous outsider betrayed by a corrupt and degenerate political establishment. For the next 4 years, he and his brilliant political allies, most notably Martin Van Buren of New York, methodically built a new political machine dedicated to a single purpose, Andrew Jackson's vindication in 1828. They created a network of newspapers, organized rallies and barbecues, and formed committees in every state. They were forging a new political party, the Democratic Party, a coalition of Southern planters, Western farmers, and working-class men in the northern cities. The election of 1828 was one of the most vicious and personal in American history. It was a contest not just of policy, but of character, and no attack was deemed out of bounds. The pro-Adams press portrayed Jackson as an ignorant, bloodthirsty barbarian, a military chieftain who would become a dictator. They dredged up his duels, his military executions, and even claimed his mother was a prostitute. But Jackson's supporters gave as good as they got, and they hit upon the one subject that was guaranteed to drive Jackson into a rage. They resurrected the old scandal of his marriage to Rachel. They openly branded her a bigamist and an adulteress, printing vicious pamphlets and newspaper articles that dragged her name through the mud. Jackson saw these attacks not as politics, but as a cowardly and unforgivable assault on the woman he cherished above all else. He tried to shield Rachel from the worst of it, but she saw the attacks and they wounded her deeply. She was a pious, private woman, and the public shaming sent her into a deep depression. When the election results came in, it was a thundering victory for Jackson. It was a revolution, a landslide that swept the Adams Clay establishment out of power. Jackson had been vindicated. The people had spoken. But his moment of ultimate triumph was about to turn into his moment of deepest personal tragedy. Rachel, who had long suffered from heart trouble, was physically and emotionally exhausted by the brutal campaign. In December, just as they were preparing to leave for Washington, she collapsed. For 5 days, Jackson sat by her bedside, never leaving her side, but her heart was failing. On December the 22nd, 1828, she died. Jackson was utterly destroyed. His grief was terrifying in its intensity. He refused to believe she was gone, sitting with her body for hours. At her funeral, he stood over her grave in the cold garden at the Hermitage and delivered a chilling indictment. "May God Almighty forgive her murderers," he wept, "as I know she forgave them. I never can." He was not speaking of some abstract cause of death. In his mind, his political enemies, Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and their newspaper editors, had killed her with their vicious slander as surely as if they had plunged a knife into her heart. He would go to the White House not as a triumphant victor, but as a bitter, grieving widower, convinced that the corrupt establishment had murdered his beloved wife. This profound sense of loss and betrayal would shape his entire presidency, fueling his desire for vengeance against the political and financial elites he held responsible. His inauguration on March 4th, 1829, was a scene unlike any Washington had ever witnessed. It was not a stately affair for the city's elite. It was a raucous celebration for the common man. A massive, muddy crowd of thousands. Farmers, backwoodsmen, city laborers, office seekers poured into the city to see their president take the oath of office. After the ceremony, the mob followed him to the White House and flooded into the executive mansion. They stood on satin chairs with their muddy boots, broke fine china, and got into drunken brawls over barrels of whiskey-laced punch. The genteel Washington society looked on in horror. It was the mob taking over. But for Jackson's supporters, it was a beautiful sight. It was the people's house, and the people had finally taken possession of it. The age of Jackson had begun. Andrew Jackson entered the presidency a man hollowed out by grief, but his sorrow did not soften him. It hardened him. It transformed his political agenda into a personal vendetta. He saw the world as a battlefield populated by the virtuous common people on one side and a corrupt, interwoven network of enemies on the other, the bankers, the entrenched bureaucrats, and the privileged elites whom he blamed for his wife Rachel's death. He had come to Washington not just to govern, but to wage war. His first years were consumed by internal squabbles and a bizarre social scandal that nearly tore his administration apart. Known as the Petticoat Affair or the Peggy Eaton Affair, it revolved around the wife of his Secretary of War, John Eaton. Peggy was the vivacious and intelligent daughter of a tavern keeper, but Washington society, led by the wives of Jackson's other cabinet members, ostracized her, whispering that she was a woman of loose morals. Jackson, whose own wife had been a victim of vicious gossip, saw a direct parallel. He was fiercely protective of Peggy, seeing the attacks on her as another assault by the Washington elite on an innocent woman. "I tell you," he thundered at his cabinet, "I had rather have live vermin on my back than the tongue of one of these Washington women on my reputation." The social snubbing paralyzed his government, but Jackson would not yield. He eventually accepted the resignation of most of his cabinet and reorganized it, a dramatic move that showed he valued personal loyalty above all else and would destroy his own administration rather than bend to the social conventions of the elite he despised. But this social tempest was merely a prelude to the real hurricanes of his presidency. Jackson's vision was of a simple agrarian republic, free from the complexities of modern finance and the corrupting influence of concentrated wealth. And in his eyes, the ultimate symbol of that corrupting influence, the greatest threat to American liberty, was a single powerful institution, the Second Bank of the United States. The bank was a paradox. It was a private corporation run for the profit of its wealthy stockholders, many of them British. Yet it was chartered by the federal government and served as the depository for all of the nation's tax revenue. It had the power to regulate credit, to issue currency, and to influence the economic fortunes of every citizen. In short, it was the central nervous system of the American economy. Its president, Nicholas Biddle, was everything Andrew Jackson was not, an aristocratic, brilliant, and arrogant Philadelphian who believed that he, not the president, truly understood what was best for the country's financial future. Biddle saw Jackson as a dangerous, ignorant backwoodsman who threatened to undo all of his careful work. Jackson, in turn, saw Biddle as the king of a corrupt financial oligarchy, a man who used the bank's immense power to reward his political friends and punish his enemies, a hydra of corruption that wrapped its tentacles around the throat of the common man. For Jackson, the bank was unconstitutional, undemocratic, and un-American. He believed it concentrated too much power in the hands of too few unelected men, making a mockery of the people's will. "The bank," he wrote, "is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." The Great Bank War began in earnest in 1832. Biddle, urged on by Jackson's political rivals Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, decided to force the issue. Although the bank's charter was not due to expire for another 4 years, they pushed a bill through Congress to recharter it early. It was a political trap. They reasoned that if Jackson signed the bill, he would alienate his populist base who hated the bank. If he vetoed it, he would be portrayed as a reckless demagogue, destroying a vital national institution, a move they believed would cost him his re-election. Jackson did not flinch. He took the bait and relished the fight. On July 10, 1832, he issued one of the most powerful and consequential vetoes in American history. His veto message was not a dry legal or economic argument. It was a blistering populist manifesto, a call to arms for the common man. He blasted the bank as a tool for the rich, a monopoly that granted titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful. He pitted the honest farmers, mechanics, and laborers of America against the stock jobbers and financiers. He concluded with a ringing declaration: "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the axe of government to their selfish purposes. If it would confine itself to equal protection and, as heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing." In the act before me, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles. Biddle and his allies were ecstatic. They thought the veto message was a piece of radical, economically illiterate nonsense that would surely doom Jackson. "It has all the fury of a chained panther biting the bars of his cage," Biddle sneered. They printed and distributed thousands of copies of the message, believing it would expose Jackson as a fool. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The common people read Jackson's words and heard the voice of their champion. He had framed the debate not around banking policy, but as a moral struggle between the people and the aristocracy, between liberty and tyranny. The election of 1832 became a national referendum on the Bank of the United States. Jackson, running under the banner of Jackson and No Bank, won a crushing, overwhelming victory. He saw his re-election as a clear mandate from the people: kill the bank. He did not wait for its charter to expire. In an unprecedented and legally questionable move, he ordered the removal of all government deposits from the national bank and their redistribution into a number of state-chartered banks, which his critics derisively labeled pet banks. Biddle, enraged and desperate, decided to show the country how much it needed him. He tightened credit and called in loans in a move many contemporaries believed was an attempt to engineer a financial crisis, hoping to cause enough economic pain that the public would demand the bank's restoration. "Nothing but the evidence of suffering," he wrote, "will produce any effect." But his tactic backfired spectacularly. The public saw his actions as proof of everything Jackson had been saying, that a single, unelected man held the power to wreck the economy for his own political ends. The business community turned on Biddle and his panic collapsed. The Bank of the United States was dead. Jackson had won his greatest political victory. He had slain the monster and, in his view, restored economic liberty to the people. In 1835, his administration achieved something that seems fantastical today. Through budget surpluses from land sales and customs duties, it paid off the entire national debt. It is the only time in American history this has ever happened. But his victory came at a high cost. The destruction of the central bank and the distribution of funds to loosely regulated state banks fueled a massive speculative bubble in Western land. When that bubble inevitably burst in 1837, just after Jackson left office, it triggered one of the worst economic depressions in the nation's history, the Panic of 1837. Jackson's war, fought for the common man, would leave many of those same common men destitute. But for Jackson, the principle was what mattered. He had broken the power of the financial elite, and he had fundamentally and permanently expanded the power of the presidency, establishing the office as a direct representative of the people's will. His opponents, who now called themselves the Whigs, began to caricature him as a tyrant, King Andrew I, trampling the Constitution under his feet. While Jackson was waging his popular war against the bank, he was simultaneously pursuing a far darker and more devastating campaign. This was a war not against an institution, but against a people. It was the culmination of his lifelong belief that America was a white man's country, and that the original inhabitants of the land were a primitive obstacle to its divinely ordained destiny. This was the policy of Indian removal. The 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, were not nomadic hunter-gatherers. They had become settled agricultural societies. The Cherokee in particular had made a remarkable transformation. They had created a written language thanks to their brilliant scholar Sequoyah. They had a formal written constitution. They lived in log cabins, cultivated farms, and even owned slaves, adopting many of the economic and social customs of their white neighbors. They had done everything the United States government had asked of them to become civilized. But they had made one fatal error. Their lands in Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee sat atop fertile cotton-growing soil, and gold had recently been discovered in the Georgia hills. The state of Georgia, hungry for this land, passed laws nullifying the Cherokee Constitution and claiming jurisdiction over their territory, a clear violation of existing federal treaties. The Cherokee, rather than take up arms, put their faith in the white man's legal system. They sued the state of Georgia, and their case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1832, in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall delivered a landmark ruling. He declared that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community, and that the laws of Georgia had no force within its borders. The Cherokee had won a stunning legal victory. Their victory was, however, meaningless. The President of the United States, the man sworn to uphold the nation's laws, had no intention of enforcing the court's decision. Jackson is often attributed with the remark, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it," though historians note there is no contemporary evidence he actually said it. His actions, if not his precise words, spoke volumes. He had long before made his position clear. In his first message to Congress, he had called for the removal of all eastern tribes to a new Indian territory west of the Mississippi River, in what is now Oklahoma. He couched this policy in paternalistic terms, arguing it was for their own good to protect them from the inevitable conflicts with white settlers. But this was a flimsy veil for a brutal land grab. In 1830, he had pushed the Indian Removal Act through Congress. The act authorized him to negotiate treaties of removal, and his agents used every dirty trick at their disposal: bribery, intimidation, and dealing with unauthorized minority factions to secure the signatures they needed. The Choctaw were the first to be removed in the winter of 1831. Theirs was a horrifying ordeal, a poorly organized trek marred by blizzards, floods, and a cholera epidemic. An estimated 4,000 Choctaw, a quarter of the entire tribe, died on the journey. A Choctaw leader sadly remarked that their removal was a trail of tears and death. The phrase would prove prophetic. The Cherokee held out, clinging to the rule of law. But Jackson's government simply ignored it, recognizing a fraudulent treaty signed by a powerless few. In 1838, the argument of law was over. The argument of bayonets had begun. The federal troops under General Winfield Scott descended on the Cherokee Nation. They dragged 16,000 men, women, and children from their homes at bayonet point so quickly that the food was still warm on their tables. They were herded into filthy, disease-ridden concentration camps. Then the death march began. In the dead of winter, they were forced to walk over 1,000 miles to the west. One group after another was driven forward through snow and freezing rain. They had little food, thin blankets, and no proper shelter. The sick, the elderly, and the children began to die by the hundreds. Pneumonia, typhus, and dysentery swept through the camps. A Georgian soldier who participated in the removal later wrote, "I fought through the Civil War and have seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered by thousands, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew." Historians estimate that around 4,000 Cherokee men, women, and children perished on what their descendants rightfully call the Trail of Tears. This was not simply a tragic policy outcome. It was a state-sponsored campaign of ethnic cleansing, meticulously planned and executed under the authority of the man who called himself the people's president. Amidst this campaign of destruction, the story of Lincoln, the Creek orphan Jackson had adopted, stands as a haunting and inexplicable contradiction. Jackson raised the boy at the Hermitage, provided him with an education, and expressed what seemed to be genuine fatherly affection for him. He even tried to secure him an appointment at the West Point Military Academy. But this private act of mercy was walled off from his public policy of racial extermination. He could love the one while dispossessing and destroying the many. It was a psychological paradox that we can observe, but perhaps never truly understand. Lincoya would ultimately die of tuberculosis in his late teens, a tragic symbol of a connection that might have been lost in an ocean of racial hatred. As his second term neared its end, Jackson's body was failing. He was racked by constant pain from the bullets he carried and the diseases that plagued him. But the old warrior's fire had not dimmed. On January 30th, 1835, he would face one last, immediate threat to his life. As he was leaving a memorial service in the Capitol Rotunda, a man stepped out from the crowd, stood just a few feet away from the president, aimed a pistol directly at his heart, and pulled the trigger. There was a loud metallic click. The percussion cap had exploded, but it had failed to ignite the gunpowder. In that split second, as onlookers gasped in horror, the assailant, an unemployed house painter named Richard Lawrence, calmly drew a second pistol, aimed, and pulled the trigger again, and again a click. The second pistol also misfired. The 68-year-old president, frail and leaning on a cane, did not cower or retreat. He exploded into a fury. With a roar of rage, he lunged at his attacker and began to savagely beat him with his heavy hickory cane. He clubbed Lawrence again and again, refusing to stop until a crowd of aides and congressmen, including Davy Crockett, managed to wrestle the would-be assassin away and subdue him. It was later discovered that both of Lawrence's pistols were properly loaded and in perfect working order. Later commentators suggested the odds of two independent misfires were extremely low, perhaps one in over 100,000. For Jackson and his supporters, it was a sign of divine providence. Old Hickory was indestructible, protected by God himself. Richard Lawrence was later found not guilty by reason of insanity and confined to an asylum for the rest of his life. Andrew Jackson left the presidency in 1837, handing over the office to his chosen successor, Martin Van Buren. He retired to the Hermitage, but he remained a towering figure in American life, the patriarch of the Democratic Party, his letters and advice sought by presidents and politicians. His final years were a constant battle against his body's decay. He suffered from dropsy, which caused his body to swell painfully, and his old wounds ached relentlessly. On June 8, 1845, at the age of 78, the old soldier's fight was finally over. Surrounded by his family, friends, and his enslaved servants, he died in his bed. According to some reports, his last words expressed a hope to meet both white and black in heaven. It was a final confounding statement from a man who was a walking contradiction. He was buried in the garden at the Hermitage, in the tomb he had built for his beloved Rachel years before, finally reunited with the woman whose honor he had so violently defended and whose death he had never stopped avenging. So how do we judge this man? How do we reconcile the hero and the monster? To try and find a single simple label for Andrew Jackson is to fail. He forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that a person and a nation can embody the highest ideals and the most horrific sins at the same time. He was, without question, a great Democrat. He shattered an era of elite insider rule and threw open the doors of politics to the common white man. He championed the poor against the rich, the farmer against the financier. He instilled in American politics a populist energy and an anti-aristocratic ethos that resonates to this day. He was a staunch patriot who paid off the national debt and stared down secessionists to preserve the federal union. He was a man of the people, and they loved him for it, because in his incredible story, The Orphan Who Became President, the backwoodsmen who humbled the elite. They saw their own aspirations reflected. And yet, that same man was a ruthless slave owner whose wealth and power were built on the stolen labor of hundreds of human beings. The democracy he expanded was a democracy for white men only, built upon a foundation of racial subjugation. And he was the architect of a policy of ethnic cleansing that resulted in the death of thousands of Native Americans and the theft of their ancestral homelands. This is not a footnote to his story. It is a central chapter. It is a legacy of such profound cruelty that it prompted the 21st century decision to remove his face from the $20 bill and led to the toppling of his statues by protesters who see him not as a hero, but as a symbol of racial violence. He was the perfect, terrifying embodiment of 19th century America, fiercely democratic and fiercely racist, committed to liberty for some and tyranny for others, a builder of a great nation and a destroyer of other nations. His life is a mirror held up to America's own dual nature. The battles he fought over the power of the presidency, the concentration of wealth, the rights of the common citizen, and the nation's moral obligations are battles we are still fighting today. To remember Andrew Jackson is not to celebrate him or to condemn him, but to wrestle with him. It is to acknowledge the immense complexity of history, to understand that good and evil are often hopelessly intertwined. He was a man of iron who left a legacy of both inspiration and shame. He expanded the boundaries of American democracy, but drew those boundaries in blood. He was Old Hickory, the people's president, the great Democrat, and the great destroyer. And the long, dark shadow he casts is a shape that America still recognizes whenever it looks at its own reflection.